So I don't know if you've already heard, but the vegan bubble has burst.
Coming up, as its popularity plummets, is it time to call out veganism for what it actually is, an eating disorder?
Over the past year or so, a very prevalent narrative has begun to emerge, which is that veganism is in decline. But is this actually true? Well, the first thing to recognize is that over the past 12 to 24 months or so, there has been a decline in the sales of plant-based meats, and there have also been brands that have pulled certain plant-based products from the shelves. So if we establish that there has been a drop-off in the plant-based alternatives market, well then surely that's that. Right? But before we dig a little deeper into this and see what is actually going on, I want to talk about a company producing plant-based food that's not for humans, but instead for dogs. But wait, can dogs even eat plant-based? Well, yes, they can, which is especially true thanks to Omni, who is sponsoring today's video. Omni is a vet-founded and science-backed plant-based dog food brand that have all of their products analyzed post-production to ensure they deliver the necessary nutrients to allow your dog to thrive. Now, some pet parents might be concerned that dogs can't be healthy on a plant-based diet, but this is actually not true. For example, a study published in April last year analyzed a cohort of dogs eating plant-based diets for over a year and found that their clinical parameters, including their blood work, urine, and stools, well, they were all perfectly healthy. There were even dogs with nutrient deficiencies on meat-based diets who overcame their deficiencies after being switched to a plant-based diet. Which brings me back to Omni, who, as well as having dry food for all ages from puppy to senior, also have a new range of wet food pouches as well. These pouches not only have comparable protein to meat, but also contain iron, B12, and other essential nutrients for dogs. So by choosing Omni, you're not only providing your dog with science-backed nutrition, but are also contributing to a more sustainable and compassionate world. And on top of all of this, you can even get 30% off Omni products now by clicking the link in my description and using the code ED30. So a huge thank you to Omni for firstly demystifying plant-based diets for dogs and also for sponsoring today's video. And now let's get back to it. I want to cast your mind back to 2018 and 2019. This was a good time for the vegan movement. Lots of positive media attention, lots of new products emerging all of the time, and lots of positive conversations about food innovation. In fact, The Economist called 2019 the year of the vegan. So what changed? Well, the meat industry found itself struggling to counteract lots of the positive attention around the plant-based sector and needed to come up with a plan. So in steps the rather subtly titled Center for Consumer Freedom. Now, consumer freedom, who doesn't love that, right? It's reassuring knowing that there is an organization out there looking to protect our freedoms as consumers. Except CCF is not about protecting consumers. It's about protecting industry. In fact, CCF is a group founded and run by Rick Berman, a PR man. Now, Rick has a long history of engaging in things that most people would find ethically deplorable, but not Ricky. Throughout his history, Rick has worked with the tobacco industry, downplaying the impact of tobacco smoke. He worked to oppose the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also the raising of minimum wage and low wages for workers. He has attacked anti-drink driving organizations and worked to pass laws to reduce the rights of employees, such as paid sick leave. He's worked with Monsanto, fossil fuel companies, and the agricultural industry. Rick does this by setting up front companies that act as a shield for corporate interests and allow big players to remain anonymous, or at least be disconnected from what these organizations are doing on their behalf. In a secret recording, Rick was recorded saying this to an audience.
People always ask me one question all the time. He said, how do I know that I won't be found out as a supporter of what you're doing? We run all of this stuff through nonprofit organizations that are insulated from having to disclose donors. There's total anonymity. People don't know who supports us. We've been doing this for 20-something years in this regard. To the degree that anybody is concerned about that, I will tell you that there's all sorts of ways, all sorts of firewalls that have been established to get this done.
Rick Berman has also told the executives that fund his front companies that they must be willing to exploit emotions like fear, greed, and anger. Basically, Rick Berman is a corporate lobbyist and mercenary for hire who has worked with a who's who of the worst industries and companies that you can think of. Which, funnily enough, brings me back to the meat industry. So there we are back in 2018 and 2019. Plant-based alternatives are exciting, new, innovative, and the meat industry is struggling to find messaging that sticks. So who are you going to call? Rick Berman. You see, this isn't new for Rick because Rick has been for decades attacking animal rights and animal welfare organizations in the US. So in September 2019, Rick's Center for Consumer Freedom put this ad in USA Today. In describing the ad on their website, CCF stated, "The ad compares real bacon to fake bacon, an ultra-processed imitation," which is a pretty interesting criticism considering that real bacon is also processed. Oh, and it's also a class 1 carcinogen. I mean, just think about this. Imagine what would be being said if the WHO had classified plant-based alternatives as a class 1 carcinogen. But at least we know that Rick and CCF definitely care about our health, which is why Rick and his team have worked with Monsanto, the tobacco industry, the alcohol industry, the fossil fuel industry, the meat industry, and companies like Coca-Cola. Because what you have to understand is that Rick, well, he just really cares about us, the consumers. But anyway, the pushback had begun. Then in early 2020, CCF created this advert.
Your word is methylcellulose.
Can you please define that?
Methylcellulose. It's a chemical laxative that is also used in synthetic meat.
Why?
Sorry, incorrect.
You might need a PhD to understand what's in synthetic meat. Fake bacon and burgers can have dozens of chemical ingredients. If you can't spell it or pronounce it, maybe you shouldn't be eating it. Go to cleanfoodfacts.com.
Bacon. BACON.
Now, the idea that you shouldn't eat something that you can't spell is utterly ridiculous. You could do the same advert and use the words alpha-tocopherol, otherwise known as vitamin E. What about docosahexaenoic acid? Just try and spell that. It's actually the full name of the long-chain fatty acid, DHA, which ironically is a nutrient vegans are told they can't get, even though it originates in algae. So hang on a minute, let me just try and work this out for a second. Should we not eat things that we can't spell or pronounce, or are vegans deficient in things that we can't spell or pronounce? It's all a bit confusing, isn't it? Which is actually kind of the point. These industries work by spreading doubt and confusion in the mind of the consumer, because in such cases, people tend to resort to the status quo or their more default position. Even though these arguments are reductive and nonsensical, they also work. And just a point on methylcellulose. Methylcellulose is not absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract like fiber and is not toxic. It's actually used in quantities much higher than is found in plant-based alternatives for the treatment of constipation. I mean, it's actually quite ironic that meat eaters criticize plant-based alternatives for containing something that they would then take in much higher amounts to deal with the constipation that comes from eating too many animal products and not enough fiber. It's actually reported that the US is currently going through a laxative shortage because there's too much demand. I mean, you just couldn't make this up, could you? And don't even get me started on the whole chemicals argument. We are all made of chemicals. There would be no life without the existence of chemicals. Yes, there can be bad chemicals, but people mistakenly believe that synthetic chemicals must be the bad ones and natural chemicals must be the good ones, which is just not true. I mean, anthrax, for example, is a natural chemical. And how do we treat anthrax? Well, with synthetic chemicals, such as the synthetic antibiotic ciprofloxacin. Although saying that, anthrax is not only natural, but is actually easier to spell and pronounce than ciprofloxacin. So I guess anthrax must be good for us, because that's how it works. Of course, flash forward to 2024 and plant-based alternatives have become synonymous with words like ultra-processed and methylcellulose. Rather than being viewed as exciting products of food innovation, plant-based meat is viewed by many as being just about the most toxic and unhealthy food that you can consume, even though it isn't. In fact, studies show that plant-based alternatives are healthier than their animal product counterparts. A University of Bath review in 2022 examined 43 studies into the health and environmental impacts of plant-based meats, and what they found is that plant-based meat alternatives cause lower levels of greenhouse gas emissions than meat, they require much less land and water, and cause less pollution. They also have a better nutritional profile and are beneficial for things like weight loss and also building muscle mass. Another study found that plant-based alternatives increase microbiome health compared to their meat counterparts, and a different study, this time an analysis of 207 plant-based alternative products and 226 animal products in the UK, found that the plant-based products have a better nutrient profile compared to meat equivalents, as well as having lower energy density, less saturated fat, and significantly higher fiber. Now, they did tend to have higher levels of salt, but the authors stated that the study supports the claim that plant-based meat is a healthier alternative to animal products products from a chronic disease prevention perspective. Now look, I'm not saying that plant-based alternatives are the healthiest foods that you can consume, and I'm not saying that they can't contain things that are bad for us. But the current framing of them is not supported by the data. It is just currently a successful campaign that has been spearheaded by the meat industry and their lobbyists and PR contacts. Veganism is sadly currently at war with a coordinated and heavily funded campaign of misinformation and disinformation. The animal farming industries, well, they're just simply copying the playbook of the tobacco industry and the fossil fuels industry. They fund their own bogus studies, work with PR firms and lobbyists, and use media outlets to create perceived credibility and to spread their disinformation to the public. And this will have had an impact on the behavior of certain consumers. However, since 2019, there have been other, let's say, fairly impactful events. There was, of course, the pandemic, and now we are living through a time of high inflation, high interest rates, and a cost of living crisis. As such, so-called premium products, of which many plant-based meats can still be considered, are going to be among the first products that people stop buying. This means that people may have gone back to cheap meat products, or people will just be buying cheaper plant foods instead. And actually, sales of tofu have reportedly increased. And just to prove this point, the most recent records show that the UK's meat consumption is at its lowest levels since records began. So the meat bubble and vegan bubble have both burst? Well, what's interesting is plant-based diets are one of the factors attributed to the decline in meat consumption, which does run somewhat contradictory to the narrative that we are discussing in this video. However, more importantly to the broader point that I'm making, the data shows that people have actually moved towards cheaper meat and away from more expensive types of meat. And that actually, interestingly, while the highest 10% of earners were eating 10% less meat a week than a decade ago, the poorest 10% were actually eating 19% less. As well as demonstrating the point I'm making about people just generally choosing cheaper foods, this also completely invalidates the ever-present myth that plant-based diets are more expensive, as in a cost of living crisis, people are eating less meat and more plants, particularly those who are poorest. Now, add to all of this that supermarkets tend to add higher margins to plant-based meats than they do their meat counterparts, and we can begin to see that the current financial situation, as well as some of the more inherent issues stacked against the plant-based sector, such as a lack of subsidies and higher supermarket margins, are also going to be contributing factors in the decline in recent sales. Now, everything I've just mentioned could very easily be defined as being negative reasons for why the sale of plant-based meat has declined. However, this doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture. I want to take you back to the early 1980s and to an event called the video game crash of 1983. Now, the video game crash was a large-scale recession in the video game industry that occurred from 1983 to 1985. The crash was attributed to several factors, including market saturation in the number of video game consoles and available games, many of which were of poor quality. Lasting about 2 years, the crash shook a then booming video game industry and led to the bankruptcy of several companies, and analysts of the time expressed doubts about the long-term viability of video game consoles and software. And of course, as we now know, they were absolutely right, because millennials and Gen Z have never even heard of video games. Wait a second. So why do I mention this? Well, new technologies and innovations go through hype cycles. When something new and exciting and disruptive enters the market, hype and anticipation skyrockets. Now, this happens to the point where expectation becomes hyper-inflated. And during this time, the market also gets flooded with new products and companies trying to take advantage of the uptick in interest. And as a consequence, well, the market gets oversaturated with poor quality products that don't live up to the hype, and as such, people begin to shun them. At this point, you enter what is called the trough of disillusionment. This is the point where sales drop, excitement drops, and criticism creeps in. At this point, the market consolidates, and poor quality products and companies that produce them are pushed out of the market. This is exactly what happened to the video games industry in the 1980s, and is a well-known cycle for new innovations and technologies. Now, the plant-based meat market is most likely currently in the trough of disillusionment stage, and this is not necessarily a bad thing long term. In 2018 and 2019, the alternative sector became flooded with new products and new companies. Some were great, but some were not. Now, we don't need dozens of companies producing vegan chicken of differing quality, with some being objectively terrible. And we as a movement don't want poor quality products being stocked in supermarkets because people will try them and then not like them. The truth is, there are certain plant-based brands and products that cause more harm than good. Plus, many existing brands tried to capitalize on what was happening, such as Innocent, who brought out some plant milks. But there were already loads of plant milk brands, many of which were also cheaper. So why would people buy plant plant milk from a brand that most people associate with a supermarket meal deal and not oat milk. But the fact that Innocent stopped selling the plant milks has become one of the biggest pieces of evidence for the so-called vegan bubble bursting.
Now, here's a question for you. Has the vegan bubble burst?
For some of us, it was never a bubble, to be perfectly honest. But Oatly, Nestle and Innocent Drinks were amongst those pulling plant-based products.
But here's the positive news. After the trough of disillusionment comes the so-called slope of enlightenment, where stability allows for the hurdles to be overcome and organizations draw on the experience of the early adopters. The market now has a better understanding of how to achieve sustainable growth, and the quality of the products also improves. After this, you reach the plateau of productivity, where the real-world benefits of the innovation begin to be accepted more and more, and the levels of risk around the innovation are now lower. At this point, a sharp rise in adoption begins and market penetration accelerates. Now, interestingly, Catherine Shacklock, who was Waitrose's chilled vegan and vegetarian buyer, said that Waitrose's sales of vegan products had actually risen in 2023, saying that the vegan bubble hasn't burst, it's just maturing. So has the vegan bubble burst? Well, what is true is that certain plant-based companies have had a tough year or so, and that sales have decreased in plant-based categories. But the success of veganism is not determined solely by plant-based meat. After all, veganism is an ethical philosophy, and the merits of the philosophy are not based on the sales of burgers. Now, interestingly, a survey published at the start of this year showed that in the UK in 2023, 1.1 million more people became vegan, and a further 2 million people intend to adopt a plant-based diet in 2024. Now look, we should obviously take surveys like this with a pinch of salt, but even if there might be a margin of error within the numbers, it is interesting that there is an indicator of a significant rise in the number of people going vegan, while at the same time we are being told that the vegan bubble has burst. The truth is, this is a weaponized narrative that plays exceptionally well for the media and, of course, for many consumers. It's clickbaity, it drives up ad revenue, and it tells many people what they want to hear. But this argument reduces the word veganism from being about an ethical philosophy to a word that is really just a synonym for plant-based meat. It views the vegan movement through the lens of burger sales, which overlooks what veganism actually is, and that people can be vegan without eating burgers. The next 12 to 24 months will undeniably be interesting for the plant-based food sector, and there will almost certainly be challenges that need to be overcome. But reactionary agenda-driven headlines hide the truth that dips and troughs are part of the course for new innovations. And just as the video game crash of 1983 didn't end up depriving the world of Mario, thank goodness, the current dips in plant-based alternatives don't reflect a vegan demise where the world will be deprived of plant-based burgers, much to the disappointment of certain media pundits and social media commentators. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I really do appreciate it. And as always, let me know down below in the comments what you think about what it is that I've said throughout this video. All right, guys, thank you again for watching, and a huge thank you also to Omni for sponsoring today's video.